Welcome back, fellow armchair generals, to another episode of Hearts of Iron 4 with Black Ice. This is Gamer 1745 here, and we're going to continue this. We've got our island garrison spread all out over here. Okay, electromechanical engineering, which is basically something I don't think the Japanese are doing at this time, but alright. Mechanical computing, maybe a bit. I don't think much. But let's go in here. For the fun of it. And let's look for a general. Okay, we don't want too good of one, because he's just going to sit and deal with the garrison. I looked earlier and I couldn't find one that had good defensive stats. Now, the Japanese did not believe in the defense, so gets back to that sort of national spirit thing. Now, they're also not going to gain until it gets sort of late in the game. The Rat Commando, now he isn't looking for Fortress Buster. We're not going to be attacking, so that won't be useful. Light consumption, that might be useful, so we'll put him in charge here of some of our iron garrisons. Okay, well. Okay, so that organizes them up. Now. Okay. Extra research slot, great. Now. Imperial austerity, that's useful to get down to the industrial effort. And warrior tradition is also useful too, gain national unity, which will counteract some of the fascist national unity. But first, since even though that is a shorter one, first we're going to start adding some more factories and resources. Okay. Here we want a decent general who's going to be leading our... Okay, he's Jungle Rat, so we're not going to be fighting in the south with him. Not here, so the Jungle Rat isn't... He's a Jungle Rat, but he has about everything else here. Okay. Tomo Yuki Yamashita. So we're going to give him our sort of China command. Now, and for our cavalry commander, well, winter specialist, I don't know. Offensive. Amphibious. We don't need an amphibious guy for no consumption. Also general. So we're going to give him our cavalry. Now, let's create a new theater. I'm going to have to look this up off camera. I don't know what it is. God, my memory's failing. Just call it man. Short for Manchuria for the moment, but get that better. Get that down there. I'm almost got it. Which division is this? Oh, this is a good one. The army in continental Asia was basically almost a second army for Japan. It largely ran itself. It largely did its own thing. And it was its own political influence. And I would say, we also need to start our research for the next one. Let's do HQ, communications. It's sort of the force. Well, it very much gets out of control of the army headquarters back in Japan, let alone the political establishment back in Japan, and it eventually basically becomes the force that takes over, at least that's my view of it, of the Japanese state eventually. The Navy is its own sort of independent leadership viewpoint. Just a little bit of information. Yeah, still at this time. The German army, up until the Blomberg gets fired, is an independent governmental agency, if you will. They sort of kind of make out the head of the army as, the head of the ministry of the army, but it is sort of its own independent force within German society. Now, under the Kaiser, my understanding is that the Kaiser is the head of the military, so he sort of runs that as a sort of, really sort of a state within a state, and it comes out of the Prussian. Is Prussia a state that has an army or an army that has a state? You can sort of debate that to some degree at different stages, and obviously the Hohenzollern, the Prussian monarchy, becomes the German monarchy once they force the Austrian monarchy out of Germany. But this episode isn't about all that, but it's a sort of its own independent force, and it wasn't until they were able to fire Blomberg and get him out did they really, and Hitler becomes in charge of the army at that time, though he's not the sort of the mad micromanager that we know and love so much at the second half of World War II, where he's sitting over here micromanaging the war in the East or whatever. But so it's sort of like he becomes the Minister of War or whatever, but really it's more of a moving the head of the military under the, if you will, civil government. So it's sort of like the civil government does not control the German military. Now, of course, you can obviously try to debate me on this, and definitely the civil government, taxes the people and then provides the money to pay the soldiers. So if the civil government won't pay the soldiers or won't pay for the new artillery or whatever sort of other military requirements, it needs the cooperation. So it's not like some complete independent, I want to go invade Poland, so the army tomorrow is going to go and invade Poland or anything like that. But they were sort of tried to be removed from the rest of the idea that, say, if a socialist government comes to power in Germany, the socialists can appoint the Minister of Education or the Minister of Interior, which is running the police or whatever like that. But the socialist government, the way it was set up, wouldn't be able to appoint a new head of the military. Wouldn't be able to change the military staff. It was its own sort of separate thing. Well, a similar thing is sort of happening in Japan. That's sort of why I brought it up with Germany. And I do look at this from an American perspective. I know I have a very big international audience, but a lot of them and a lot of people have grown up under sort of like in Germany or in Britain, in which this sort of, we got the tradition to some degree from the British, but whatever, the tradition that the civil government is in charge of the military, controls the military. That isn't always the case in all countries. Sometimes the military controls the civil government. That wasn't the case in Germany, and hadn't been the case in Japan. By the time Tojo gets in power, you start to see the civil government being controlled by the military. But within that, you look at the ministers had power bases, and a few times during this period, a general would become a minister, give up his military command, like say command the southern half of Japan or something, give up his military command to take the a ministerial job, and then promptly basically lose power because he lost his power base. So once during this period as the government becomes more and more militarized, they retain, and this is very much what Tojo did as head of the army, retains that military generalship while also assuming a ministerial, one or more ministerial positions. And so that's similarly with the Navy. Their power base was within the naval structure, and it was a power base that controlled particular fleets in particular areas, so that as time was going on here, you didn't have to, at a certain point, to get commands in the U.S. Army, you have to be approved by Congress. So the president goes, oh, this new Southern Command. And normally nobody ever pays attention to it. It normally just, rubber stamp, because whoever the president is, whether it's Obama or Bush or whoever, they're appointing somebody that's reasonable within the reasonable military spectrum, have never made any outrageous statements. So yeah, whoever, General so-and-so, yeah, he's competent. We rubber stamp them. In there, we may see that change under Trump if Trump, General Flynn retired, was definitely a person that did things that I think were illegal, accepting money from a foreign government without permission from the U.S. government. That is a general doing, not just in charge of a particular commander, in charge of certain intelligence forces within the U.S. government, but in the U.S. to accept money from a foreign government for doing a job, you have to get prior permission from the U.S. government. So, say if a retired U.S. Army general, somebody like General Petraeus, who was in charge of our intelligence in the U.S. for a while, wants to consult with Britain on anti-terrorist policies, or go and consult on how to run because he did run a very good counterinsurgency war in Iraq. That was part of the Petraeus push there. Wants to go and consult with the British government now as a retired general, and the British government's going to pay him, whether pay his airfare and just pay his expenses, or give him, $10 million, whatever the payment is. He has to get prior approval for the U.S. government, and for somebody like the British government, they're going to go, yeah, sure, go ahead, go do that, because you're a retired general, you're an expert on the subject, you're going to go help a fellow NATO member that isn't controversial. Yeah, go and do it, because we trust you. You're not giving up any of our governmental secrets, at least not ones that we're not willing to share with a fellow NATO member. So yeah, go do it. You just got to get written permission. You got some form, you fill it out, you get written permission. They say, yeah, go do this. Well, they would not have given the written permission, I don't believe, for what Flynn was doing with Russia, and what Flynn was doing with Turkey, who's somewhat of a controversial NATO fellow member. So that you have this, so Flynn was sort of doing this without getting prior permission to get paid by foreign governments or foreign entities. So Flynn is a controversial figure. I might agree with a lot of his viewpoints on how to fight the Islamic extremists and think that he could do a good job with that, but he didn't obey the rules, so I'm very glad that he's gone. So if you were today trying to put Flynn in charge of Southern Command or something, bring him out of retirement, it would cause a massive stir in Congress, and he probably would not get his approval. And it's sort of like to be in charge of the the Pentagon. You get appointed by the president, but you get confirmed by, I believe it's just the Senate. You get confirmed by the Senate. So it's not, and I don't know exactly how high up. I don't know if divisions have to be confirmed by the U.S. Senate or not. But at some point, it's not promotions. It's sort of your job, your permission, and some of these have to get approved by our civil government. Normally, it's a rubber stamp because normally the people are at least meet all the minimum requirements. Not necessarily the best guy, but the guy that the power structure likes. And so, when Obama was promoting some of these people up, they were good and competent people, and he was picking, if you looked at it, a lot of Democrats. One of the Democrats that he picked for I think it was Southern Command, was it? I'm sorry if I'm getting this wrong. Was to put in charge, which was sort of in charge of our war on terror, was a lifelong partisan Democrat. Oh, General Flynn. General Flynn, I don't know as a U.S. Army general in any way was out there promoting Democratic politics or Democratic politicians. In fact, there's the Hatch Amendment, which makes it illegal to do so as part of your job. So if you wore your uniform and did it, it would be illegal. You take your uniform off while still a general, you can go do that. You just can't use your office, as promoting a political position. But Flynn was and you look at some of his stuff as a young man before going to the military, an ardent Democratic supporter. Nothing wrong with that. Our military has a large, a very famous naval officer who was a nuclear scientist, was an ardent Democrat. President Jimmy Carter, becomes the U.S. president as the Democrat. But he a lifelong Democrat. And the U.S. has lots of Democrats in the military, and career military, like Webb, who was in the Army, so that they do this. So, but once you're getting up to the high levels, and the president's appointing, they sort of know and keep track of. And even though once they're in the armed forces, a lot of them stop actively pushing different political platforms, but they sort of know and they sort of pick. And I do think, until he sort of went wrong, General Flynn was a competent anti-terrorist leader, working for America. So he because he was strong on that anti-terror, though agreed with the Democrats on a lot of other issues, is why Obama basically fires him. But they sort of pay attention to it at that level, who they're picking and who they're putting into key positions that are going to enforce various policies. So trust me, the civil government knows the background. Now, there may be a bunch of general officers out there who have never registered to vote and has no clear opinion, but they've made no clear statement, and so either party will. But if you're a known partisan politician, normally, or party background, normally at the very high levels, not at your majors and your colonels and whatever, but the very high levels for your positions, they normally pay attention to that in the U.S. But as long as you're promoting somebody good, it works out. This is not the case in Japan at this time. This is various power structures that work through power politics within the armed forces, if you will, that you have your power bases. It's somewhat feudal in that sort of statement. You're in that sort of way. You're really expected to support your boss and do that. So if you get a good command, you work your way up, you keep your power bases, And that's sort of how the Japanese government works. So once you get a lot of these military guys, some are in very civil positions like Ministry of Education, which the Minister of Education during World War II, at least a good portion of it, for Japan was General Tojo, who was also Prime Minister. Now, I don't think he was daily running the Department of Education for Japan. He was in charge of it. I presume his assistant minister or whatever was actually running the department, but by being in charge of that department, he now gets to pick the assistant minister. Or if it's somebody else that he may approve and get in there, but once that guy's in there, he's now in charge of that fiefdom. He gets to run that fiefdom within the Japanese government. And yes, he can be forced out because whether he does his job badly or just something bad happens under his job, or there's other power shift change, you can be forced out. But while he's in there, he's running it his way, what he's doing. This is why Tojo acquires so many of these departments, because he wants control of them. And even though he could not have effectively even run half of his department, so he had to be picking his subordinates, but he gets to hire and fire his subordinates at his whim, so they will follow his policies. So this is how the Japanese government is being run at this time. So you had the army on the mainland, and then you have the Navy. Those are the three sort of branches. And like the earlier event that was came up to talk about how the Air Force for the Army, and it was an Army Air Force and a Navy Air Force. And there wasn't any idea of an Air Force. Remember, at this time, the United States did not have an Air Force. It had the Army Air Corps. And that was basically to the end of World War II. They did not put on the blue uniform until after World War II and leading up to, it was before Korea started, but leading up to Korea, is the U.S. Air Force is created as an independent branch. Britain had already had an independent branch Air Force, and I'm not exactly sure the date, but during World War I, it had an independent Air Force. It was not part of the Army. It was not part of the Navy. There was a naval aviation arm. Many nations, like most nations who have carriers, or even earlier and even before that, scout planes launched off of battleships and such, had a naval aviation arm. Japan was very much an army or navy military setup, and that's why you get I don't think Marine is, I don't know whether this is really more naval infantry or Marines. You know, sort of splitting hairs there. Traditionally, technically, naval infantry were sailors armed with rifles put on shore and maybe given a lot, or maybe almost none, ground combat training. That was naval infantry. Britain often used naval infantry. Generally, it was an ad hoc affair that they took naval crews off of local ships, particularly some of this during the Napoleonic Wars, the invasions of the Dutch colony in South Africa here. But they deployed naval infantry ashore. Marines traditionally were soldiers that were stationed on board ships. Britain early on, they were regular land-based regiments that were deployed on board the ships, and then after a while they became regularly deployed on ships to that they sort of set up their own structural element that sort of became more and more and more as time goes on, under the control of the Navy, but separate. And so those were Marines. And you look at the American Civil War period and the Napoleonic War period, you often have the situation that there's not enough Marines around, so they just go, oh, X battalion of regular soldiers, you're now Marines, you go serve on these ships. You didn't change your uniform, or you didn't change anything. Literally, you they just, oh, this company goes to this ship, that company goes to this ship, and 6 months later you may be back to being regular ground forces again with no different training that the standard sort of Marines on they had. You're just sort of, the units were temporarily drafted to serve on board ships because they were expanding the Navy too fast and they didn't have enough Marines to do that. So that's sort of the difference between traditionally naval infantry and Marines, is the level of combat training. So I don't know, and it's just really ignorance on my part, is just how big the naval infantry / Marines Japan had, but they definitely had some, and they were under the naval arm. Okay, we have received a small shipment of armored cars from the German Reich. This helps. Okay, these are these events that you are probably aware of, and this is sort of the other side of things. We don't have an option to opt out of it, so we will have 1% less political power. Our political power here is base value 2 per day, minus 1 whole political power for the national focus, which is of course standard, and then diff normal player minus 10%. So we have, and it's 10% from the 2, so that's why it's down at just plus at 0.8. And now we have minus 1%, so minus a little bit. Now the extra bonus in production is nice, but not now. Germany wants small arms. What would Germany do with an Arisaka rifle? I have no idea. But okay. Now this, I like that we have the ability to agree or not. We get 1% political power and output. And I do believe that this also helps a little bit with our diplomatic relations. Let's now this will flat out rebalance everything else, both production and political power gain back out, so we're in a zero-sum game. But what I want to do quickly here is okay, same ideology increase. Okay, so there is no diplomatic improvement. Okay, so we'll think about whether we want to do these in the future. Okay, basic machine tools are okay. We're going with concentrated industry. I know they give this one little bonus here, but I don't care enough about that shipyard. We're going to go with concentrated industry. And it's the only one there. I don't think at the moment we're going to do other air research at the moment, so we're going to stop that. Yeah. We're still researching there. Now I want to research this infantry gun. Why? I believe this amphibious support unit, which will help out our Marines, uses the infantry guns. So I want to research that. Just to give me the whys of it. No, it wasn't. Yeah, infantry gun. And finally here, just making sure we've got our 1936 text best researching as we can. I want to research the anti-aircraft gun. The anti-aircraft gun can be a poor man's anti-tank gun. So I want to put some into production. I will say one thing is I don't like all this empty stuff down here. Since they're using through various events, if we have one event that had a negative 100 hit to political power, some of this other stuff, you should start with a few companies, a few ministers at starting. Doesn't need to be a full everything, but you should have some of those. Now, generally you should pick the ones that are historically most prominent in 1936, which may not be the best ones to have, but at least it's something to have. Okay, more than 2,000 pieces of HQ equipment activates a new national spirit affecting the Army organization and battle plans. Okay, we now have a trained Army. You can see the green shamrock is gone, and we now have trained Army command. So we've now improved our overall division and planning speed. We don't use planning speed, but divisional organization, and though it does increase the training time, but divisional organization will be a very good thing. Expand the Zaibatsu. Other than seeing that here and realizing that it's part of the Mitsu and Mitsubishi groups, I guess, maybe corporation, I don't know, I'm sorry. Reinforce the Soviet border. Well, we want to do that once we start moving on China, so we don't need to do that just yet. Military factories. Again, 35 days. Now that we got that, we're going to go over it. The 35-day one and get that done. Now, we have... These are the new fighters, which we're trying to build a little bit of a pool of the older ones up just to have. But we're going to start get that producing there. And... let's get that vessel in production. Quality fighters are important, absolutely, but there is a certain respect for quantity of fighters, and with some of these large zones and my last playthrough, it looked like they were flying P-51s American, so I don't know if there was some sort of Lend-Lease thing or just it defaulted to that model. There was some air power over China in my last invasion, but I think it's more important just to have a sheer number of aircraft than a large number of aircraft, if you will. So I just want a volume to put up. Well, no, let's just do 36. So even though they're not the best, I just want to quickly get a bunch out there that are cheap to build in both the sense of resources as well as efficient production. So we want to, some of these that are pre-research, good, but since, well, that's 96 days, yeah. We're gonna go with expander, excavation. That is the best mechanic for the idea. There's, if you've been on the Hearts of Iron 4, the add aluminum thing, that there has been aluminum added to Asia. But there was definite expansion over this time period for things like aluminum. And because I want to do something unhistorical, I want radar for Japan. Japan was very late in the radar game. We're going to pursue this course here. Resources aren't a zero-sum game, but you just can't endlessly expand by simply dropping new factories down on some of the resources, even the resource locations. So the generic expansions are better than nothing, but they're, you know, they're something. Okay, since we're facing first a war in China, which will not need a major navy, though we do need to build up for possible action against the Allies, we're going to go with Mitsui. First, that'll give us a little more expansion. Okay, well, we're going to end the episode here. I want to thank you for watching, and I want to thank you for liking the videos. That does help, just gives more visibility. And of course, I want to hear from you, so please post questions, comments, suggestions, ideas. Tell me what you're interested in. Really helpful. See you next time for more Hearts of Iron.